Welcome to the Lazy CEO Podcast, where Jim Schleckser, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large-size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to the Lazy CEO Podcast. My name is Jim Schleckser. I am your host and the founder of the CEO Project. Well, we are in the countdown to the name change. I mentioned it in a prior podcast. We are going to change the name of the podcast from the Lazy CEO Podcast to the CEO Project. But we decided it'd be nice to get to 100 episodes. So this is episode 99. So our 100th episode will be our last one as a Lazy CEO Podcast, and then we will change the name. You should be able to track everything just like you do now. A little different picture, a little different name. But so if you don't find Lazy CEO Podcast, you'll find everything under CEO Project, as well as all of our prior stuff. But today, we're going to geek out. So hang on to your seats. We have with us our guest today, Don Schmincke. Did I pronounce that right, Don?
If you're German, it's Schmincke.
Schmincke.
But I answered anything close.
There you go. Well, as a Schleckser, I'm very sympathetic. Well, Don, when CEOs asked Don to research the high failure rates of management theory, they didn't realize the primal genetic triggers that he would unearth to grow their companies faster than traditional methods. And I cannot wait to get into that topic. What else would you expect from an MIT and Johns Hopkins researcher who was nearly arrested as a capitalist spy in the Soviet bloc, got shot off an aircraft carrier, survived in the Kurdish capital as the Ayatollah held hostages in Tehran, developed missile inertial guidance systems, while his fraternity brothers took Vegas in the book, and then later the movie 21 about card counting. So, wow, where do we start? So Don, just tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a researcher. And I know you said you sort of cross biological physical systems with businesses and look at that intersection. And there are some researchers that say all the interesting stuff happens at intersections of systems. So you feel like you're in a cool area, but how did you get to this place?
It was a total accident. I was to make some extra money. I to pay for my tuition at MIT, and I automated the Harvard MIT biomedical lab, and then ended up getting published there. But we were looking at human research studies, and I was actually one of the testing subjects. But I got interested in humans, and that became my favorite species. I even had some
it's in my top 10 too, so I totally get it.
I even have a few friends who are humans. But anyway, that's what took me to Johns Hopkins, and I did my graduate work there, and I began teaching. And I because of my background and interests, I got attached to the executive MBA program. So I started running into a lot of executives, and they started complaining about management theory, and I was never really exposed to that before. But I began to see that they were struggling with implementation and success rates. So they asked me to look at that, and then I found out that a lot of the scholarly literature of over 5 million papers now show a 70 to 90% failure rate.
Yep, I found that in my dissertation as well. It's actually been slightly getting better over time, but it's still abysmal. It's trillions of dollars of wasted money. So I concur with that analysis.
Yeah. So that's what started it. They said, could this be biological? And then as I went back over thousands of years of studying CEOs, I found out that it might be, because it's a common pattern in history. And so that's what got started. And then Oxford University gave me permission to have copyright to an ancient training program that was published 500 years ago, about a 700-year-old training program for executives. And then that became a bestseller, and everybody's wanting to know about the samurai and how they train their executives.
What was the name of the book, by the way? Bestseller. What was it?
The Code of the Executive. It came out back in the 90s, in the old days.
I might have read it. I might have read it. I read a lot of books. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So reinterpreting that was helpful, but it gave me a chance to see what they were struggling with. that we're struggling with today,
Mm-hmm.
and different ways they had of fixing the problem. But then that led to other things. So, you know, that took off. Then the next thing you know, I'm on the Wall Street Journal, I'm on CNN, and I thought, wow, did I just stumble onto something here? Because I didn't really know what I was really doing at the time.
Yeah.
Just trying to answer some questions. And that took off. So I guess they told me that I've done over 2,000 speeches and I've trained about 30,000 CEOs. So I'm starting to get the hang of it. But what I'm doing is I'm able to test these new insights that are common to anthropologists and biologists, but never really making it into the management arena. But when we started applying it, sales started doubling, tripling, sometimes 10 times. So I've just had so much fun. I'm just a learner, a researcher, and a teacher, but it's been really fun seeing the results.
Nice. Well, you can't keep us waiting. What are some of these? What are the core, 3, 5 principles or insights that come from studying, humans over many generations and the biological genetic elements? So just educate us. What did you find?
Um, I, I I was looking at an ancient model that our ancestors have used for 10,000 years, and it was how to lead humans. I found out that the reason for the high failure rates is we're so focused on like what do we got to do and how do we do it,
Mm-hmm.
and we get 30,000 books a year on what do you got to do and how do you do it. The problem with that 90% failure rate, and you probably maybe discovered this in your dissertation as well, is that it doesn't matter what these are because they're just tools. And a fool with a tool is still a fool, I was told,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not altering human decision, you see.
Yes.
And human decision drives results. You throw many tools at a problem, another 30,000 books at the problem. But if it doesn't alter human decision, it's not going to get the results you want. But then that led us to looking at what drives human decision. And, when you go back and you look at Alexander, Cleopatra, Gandhi, Hannibal Caesar, Genghis Khan, I mean, these huge market share achievements of these organizations, it was a lot about altering the beliefs of humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking what we're missing is we're not teaching how to manage the beliefs of humans. And when we start doing that, we start getting decisions that change and are different. And that's how results occur. So that ancient model is kind of a breakthrough because then we can start focusing on altering human belief.
Right.
That was done. And but it also led us to look at why are we still buying 35,000 books a year that have a 90% failure rate? And that was something that I learned when we started studying dead humans because I wrote a book with Chris Warner, who's one of the top rescue climbers in the world. And we did a thing with NBC where he was filming his K2 summit,
Mm.
which is the mountain of death. So Chris is he's pulled enough dead bodies off of mountains. What we realized in studying the dead that they were always clutching their tools. In other words, for some reason, they became overconfident, and that killed most of them.
Mm.
And I said, geez, Chris, dead companies do the same thing. They're clutching all their tools to the very end,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
go. And so we came up with a term called tool seduction.
Mm-hmm.
And tool seduction became a really interesting thing. So when I'm training CEOs, they realize like, oh my God, you know what? I think we're not using our tools. I think the tools are using us. And that's an interesting perspective because
I gotta say, I agree. There's some. I just am working on a document for some people, and my God, it's like somebody took an MBA textbook and vomited into a PowerPoint, and I'm like, why? I'm going to pick on one SWOT analysis, right? I'm like, why? I've never seen an interesting conclusion ever come from this tool.
yes,
Why do we insist on using it? It is ridiculous. But people, to your point, they clutch to it because,
yeah,
geez, I learned about it and I've always done it, so I'm going to keep doing it. And it has no impact on the business whatsoever.
that's so true. When I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, I was part of the problem, by the way. So I got to confess, I was part of the. I mean, I had great analytics programs,
Yeah.
SWOT analysis,
Yeah.
market analysis, and it was all bullshit because I couldn't figure out how does a small company start up? Everybody criticizes this company. all the thought leaders, all the management consultants and, marketing experts, they're like, it's not going to work out. It's not going to work out. These guys are doing it all wrong. And the small company grows and grows and grows and eventually dominates their market.
Mm-hmm.
And they never use the analysis. I was curious, like, is somebody saying something about this? Why aren't we saying something? So as I started looking at it, I began realizing how I was wrong. I was teaching strategy as analysis. And I realized when I looked at most of our clients, because we've done hundreds of industries, their strategic plans weren't strategic.
Yeah, of course not. They're always super tactical. I've struggled with this. Let's do strategy. And they go, all right, what color napkins are we going to do at the picnic? I'm like, oh my God. Like, you could not be more tactical, right?
But I think it was tool seduction.
Yeah.
Because we get seduced to our tools, and analysis is the foundation of these tools.
Interesting.
And we die clutching on to our analysis.
So are we going to ditch all analysis?
No, it's actually very helpful for tactics. You need tactics. Tactics are great. Yeah. Problem is, and I learned this in work when we were transforming the U.S. Navy using these models. It was a great laboratory for me to understand some of them was these brilliant people that are leading our armed forces. And I've learned that, you could be tactically, and you can have like an operating system that's excellent, but if your strategy is flawed, you're going to lose the war.
Of course.
Yeah. And but what's interesting was the flip. If you have a strategy for winning that works, you can make any number of tactical or operational errors and win.
Yep.
And that's when I began to realize why are we using tactics and being so confused that it's strategy? And I began to realize I'm teaching it wrong.
Yep.
I was teaching it as analysis when really, when I looked at these companies that outmaneuvered the world and dominated, they were using intuition.
Yeah.
They were all
really
beliefs about.
Now that's not teachable though. You just blew up about 400 MBA programs in one sentence, man. You can't teach intuition.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to.
Yeah. So is that it? Trust your gut? Is that part of the better way of going after this?
Some of that works really well when you look at some of these dimensions, but also you can use it when you have your team together. And we started experimenting with this 25 years ago, and it started working. When you get the right people in a room, you can invoke certain almost Socratic methods to challenge their current beliefs about reality.
Yep.
And then using different models that actually stimulate the looking at the reality differently, they begin to emerge in a more intuitive space to look at really three dimensions. And you know all this, but for your
No, I'm curious, please.
Well, it's like when you go to our ancestors and you ask them, how did you out intuit the enemy's moves? Not out analyze them, out intuit them and dominate the world. Well, they said it's so simple. We keep telling this to you. Where's the battlefield? Who's the enemy? And how do we win?
Okay.
But looking at those three areas, it's like, yeah, when you look at the winners, they're seeing the battlefield differently than the status quo. So the first shift in beliefs is where's the battlefield we're going on? Like, Southwest they weren't competing against airlines. They were competing against Greyhound bus.
Yep.
All
yep.
the other
Certainly in the early days. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It was just what was going on in the early, they blew up the whole industry. It was just little things like you look at Apple, you look at these companies that just dominated markets, they were looking at it differently. But then you look at the enemy, and that's another area of intuitive belief shift. So you take a group through that. Well, it's our rivals. It's our rivals. It's like, well, most of the dead had arrows coming in from the back. Your enemy may be behind you.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think about when you want to position, don't position against a competitor, position against an alternative choice.
Alternative choice. And it could be what's happening behind you, globalization, economics, supply chain issues. I mean, what are the things that are killing you? But that alters winning. And so that was really the breakthrough in using that model to transform.
Okay. So battlefield, enemy, and when you say winning, talk to me a little bit about that. What does that mean?
Basically, once you've altered your beliefs around the battlefield and the enemy, is how do you out intuit the enemy's moves? In other words, how do you outmaneuver? How do you approach now the market with something so unique the enemy won't have any idea what you're doing? And so they're going to react differently. In fact, I'm meeting with George Stalk next week in Miami, and I ran into him by accident. And I'm so privileged to run into brilliant people in my research. And he's the guy that started the lean manufacturing revolution. And he's written a number of Harvard Business School articles. So we get together like every month or so, and we just have a wonderful time because I'm privileged to have this genius look at my research and critique it.
Yeah.
What was interesting is he started looking at my research and he said, yeah, he says, it's interesting. Legacy beliefs, when you have a company under attack by a new belief system, they respond with legacy strategies.
Man.
And how many companies are operating off legacy strategies, thinking they're doing strategy, and they're not. And so when you begin to look at this, I think it opens up a whole new way of transforming competition and how winning occurs. But it's really around that intuitional piece.
Yep.
Outmaneuver the enemy is the key.
Now, has this worked? I want to get a real life example of it, but it feels like in the public environment, this could be a little bit hard to explain, right? Because on the other side, you've got, roomfuls of MBAs analyzing your business and relative positioning and, trends. And you're like, no, we're not going to talk about that. So give us an example or two where this has really worked successfully.
We took a real estate developer. Actually, it was a builder of residential, and they were doing well, about 7 million in revenue. And what was happening is when we went through this, they realized their enemy wasn't other real estate development companies that were building residential properties. It was really China. It was globalization. See, the enemy was behind it, and the supply chain. At the time, this was a few years ago, the Chinese were sucking cement out of the planet, so you couldn't get cement.
Got it.
So how are we going to outmaneuver the enemy? Well, the enemy's China, right? So it happened by accident. One of the VPs in the back of the room said, well, why don't we just buy the ready-mix plant?
Yeah.
And the CEO was like, that's a stupid idea. We don't know how to run the business. So after they bought the ready-mix plant.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I can see you won that argument.
I mean, when he's like, guess who ended up with cement and guess who didn't get it?
Yeah.
So they went from 7 million in revenue. 2 years later, they're 70 million, 10 times.
Because their point of constraint was supply chain and specifically cement.
That was the enemy. And when
should have Ford bought a chip manufacturer when they couldn't get chips to put in their cars?
That's good. Well, there are a lot of other issues.
Well, I mean, it was just one of the critical points of constraint a few years back, right?
Yeah, and they're realizing that now, and that's why a lot of people are thinking about taking critical technologies and making them at home, because of what can happen when that gets disrupted. So yeah, the whole issue of globalization is we're almost like going non-global.
Yeah. Well, Peters said this was a bunch of years back. Gosh, I'm going to date myself, but he said, outsource everything, but don't outsource your soul. And the problem is most people don't know what their soul is.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Right.
So your point, like cement turns out to be the soul of that business and they had it outsourced and they shouldn't have, for example.
Yeah.
Does this work in a public environment as well? I mean,
you mean for a public company or?
Yeah, public company.
Yeah, it does. Because any size, we've done this with two guys in a kitchen doing a startup, high-tech startup.
Yep.
To the U.S. Navy.
Okay.
So it can work at any size company. And so we've worked with various, Apple implemented a lot of this stuff through my colleague Cameron Logman. We've done work, we put DuPont in the Team of the Year awards 20 some years ago. So it works in huge
companies.
Well. The problem is the leadership, though. I mean, are you able to challenge the beliefs and transform them without running them through committees? And that's where
good ideas go to die. Yeah. So how do you do that? I mean, that's a real cultural shift that they have to make. I get sort of your questions and they're answerable, hopefully, not requiring deep analysis, but that's cultural change at the top, the middle, and the bottom. So how do you shift an organization to think differently. We're not going to rely on our spreadsheets and our SWOT analysis. And we're like, that's not the way we run the business anymore. How do
Yeah.
you do that?
Well, I think once the executive team has the transformation and they have that mental, that belief shift around, how we're going to win, because
Yep.
that's really the issue. What does winning really mean for us? Because that's a question that's never really asked. How
Mm-hmm.
are we going to do it by, this what we described? Then they're able to move into critical success factors, and then they start driving the objectives and timelines and all that. Now, in the space of that, they need to get the middle management engaged, the lower
Yep.
level engaged, and then the culture issue comes up. And this is interesting because generally companies just have content as culture. Well, here's our list. It's on their website and it's hanging on the wall.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's great, but do they believe in it? Because we're watching their behaviors.
Mm.
I don't think they give a shit about your values.
Ah,
And all of a sudden it's like, well, I see the evidence. So it's like, well, how do I alter that? And it's like, well, first, we have to get them to believe on what winning means and how you're going to do it. And so when we look at that, the failed culture change programs, as you know, are 90% of the time.
yeah.
We found out they're not triggering human grouping instincts. This is another biological insight.
Mm-hmm.
And we went back, and as I've done expeditions once or twice a year, I'm going to remote regions around the world. I've been in the most extreme, sometimes stupid areas where I could have a problem. But I began to see how they were altering their culture, and they were doing it in ways that we don't teach.
Hmm.
And what they were doing is they were stimulating tribal grouping instincts that are in our cells because we grew up as a grouping species.
Sure.
Nope.
That was a survival mechanism.
Yeah, because if you're grouped, you live, and if you're not grouped, you die. So
It's really fundamental. Yep. Mm-hmm.
very fundamental. And the problem is we don't know. I wish somebody would help me change the school system in a way where we can accommodate this because our children have this program in their bodies. So when they ostracize from a group, they react as if it's near death experience.
Mm-hmm.
The fears and the anxiety, and they just, it's, and when you get an adult, you're like, well, I don't hang out with those assholes anyway. But when you're a kid, it's a big deal. And unfortunately, some of these children may kill themselves or other students.
Yeah.
We need to stop. I think we need to look at what this is. It's a biological reaction, but in a positive way. In a company, you can trigger tribal grouping instincts and doing the things that we never thought about before. Anthropologists know this. How do you alter the symbols and the rituals and the magic in your tribe? And no one teaches that. I mean, like a scientist do, but it's like what are the symbols of the old regime that need to be destroyed?
Yep.
That
Yeah.
are,
Well, go travel through Spain and you'll see, Moorish, you
oh,
know,
yeah.
with a Christian temple on top of it with a right.
I
I
mean,
mean,
the
they
gods.
got destroying the other
Oh,
symbols. They
yeah.
got that.
I love that. I love that. I was at one of the digs there. Then, as you probably saw to yourself, it's like you look at these civilizations, and there were these different levels, and it was like in each case, the symbols and the rituals changed, and the magic being the magic myths that they talk about. The stories they share with each other. I've never met a culture change expert or consultants that actually know anything about this, but when you start applying it, it's magical because things start happening.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what CEOs need to learn how to do.
Mm.
Because yeah, they have a new strategic direction. They need to change the beliefs of their tribe, and yet they don't know how to do that. And
Well, because we're engineers and accountants and we're all super logical and all this stuff is not the way our brains work. The book that did talk to this at some level was Made to Stick by the Heath brothers.
oh yeah, I remember that.
Right. So, they said, they're not, there's a reason why it's Aesop's fables or Jesus talked in parables. It's because people remember them. Right. And they went kind of a marketing direction with it. But I think you're completely right. Like what stories we tell ourselves about ourselves
Yeah, yeah. And
defines our culture. Right.
simple. Like I do this workshop where sometimes a CEO hear me do a 3 hour workshop and then say, hey, can you do this in my company? So pull together all the management team. And so we could have, I don't know, 20, 30, 100 people. And I take them through a 7 hour experience, breakout groups, all this other stuff. Did this advertising for him. Funny, he's a good another case study. And the next day, the guy calls and says, you know what? That was great. Finally, these issues got out that I knew were there. We've got your model, your 7-step model, and we're implementing, but I couldn't figure out why are they resisting TikTok? and Instagram. And finally, at 3 o'clock this morning, my I jump out of bed in a cold sweat. My wife's like, "What's going on?" She goes, "I got it. It's that symbol thing. That's why they're not following. Because on my main hallway, I have hanging up on the walls all of our awards for our Yellow Pages advertising."
Print ad awards. So now I know what's important in this organization, right? Print ads.
Next morning, he pops the truck as he pulls into the parking lot, pulls out a crowbar. He starts tearing that off the
Nice.
walls.
Nice.
I said, you know what? And it worked. I said, because when that happens, people realize our beliefs are changing. In other words, it's better than any speech. See, people think, well, I'll hang up posters up around, I'll give a speech, and that'll change. No, you destroy a symbol.
Yeah.
That's different.
Interesting. There's a story about a hospital administrator took over from a guy, I don't know if it was a guy or a gal, but prior administration, closed door, hierarchical, he said, we're not going to run like that. Had the door of his office taken off by maintenance, hung in the lobby. And so when everybody walked in every day, that damn door was right above them. And then he behaved as he indicated as well. So they go, wow, the symbol and the action.
I love that.
And he opened up the organization as a result of it. He's like, it's no longer acceptable to be hierarchical and closed door. That
I
was
love it. See, that's exactly right. That was more than any speech he could have given. And look, this is not new. The Romans did this. The Romans had a great merger and acquisition campaign going on.
Yes, they did.
Whenever they take over a city, what do? They tear down all the statues.
Yeah. And plant wine, by the way, but that's a whole separate conversation.
Yes.
That's very funny. It sounds like you got another book in here, like, Neanderthal leadership, right? What did they do in the tribes that we can learn from, right?
No, it's a great idea. I mean, the book I had come out, Winners and Losers, just this year. I couldn't believe how it took off, only because I wrote it for armchair entrepreneurs, people just starting out in a business.
Yeah.
Like 30,000 CEOs that I've studied. So I know it took off. It was like all of a sudden people are like going through it. And I have that in there, like the symbols and,
Yeah, good.
And so I think people are ready for these kinds of conversations, because it became like a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And I was like, what? I just did it for this niche.
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about, actually, maybe more today than ever, people are ready to challenge the status quo, challenge the mythologies of these antiquated things, and just look at leading differently. And it sounds like you and your organization are part of that movement. So I think,
doing our little part. It's funny though, in my dissertation, I talked about this sort of 50+% failure rate and a different way of thinking about strategy and tactics and how they relate to each other, which was akin to Mintzberg up at McGill. He talked about this a fair amount, but also Donald Sull at MIT talks about it as strategy as simple rules. So it's sort of there was more important about how we make decisions and how we resolve conflict than the actual, well, do X, Y. It wasn't tactical, right, at all. His whole model. And it was very much based on complex adaptive systems that you can't really be so prescriptive on a couple. So you have to be directional as opposed to prescriptive, which I think is very akin to what you're talking about. We're talking about how we do things and our stories, not exactly what has to be done. That's less important.
And that's where, I learned a lot working with Black Hawk Down, the movie and the book. And Matt Eversman spent a lot of time with him to understand, spent about a year. He likes Italian wine, so we spent a lot of time with Italian wine. Understand.
Hey, sign me up for the next session. I'm in.
And what I learned from him was that we teach planning poorly today, because we teach here's the plan. So
it's horrible.
It's like, no, plans never work because the enemy has a vote. He says, so we'll not survive the first shot with the enemy. So the only way to win is to constantly adapt and adapt and adapt. And when you look at the movie, that's exactly what they were doing. They were adapting like every 10 minutes. Most companies, adaptation is seen. Here's the belief shift again. Oh, I can't be off course. I'll look like I'm not being accountable. I'm not being competent. I'm wrong. So we can't. But it's not. That's the opposite. You're supposed to be off course.
Yeah. And that was really one of the conclusions of the dissertation, that it's a double loop learning system, right? Loop one, learning about how we're doing the tactical stuff, but then above that, a what are we doing, a strategic loop, right? Like, okay, that's not working. Let's change strategies, right? Up to including balling it up if we're really wrong, right? But it's so hard to do.
It's George Stock mentioned earlier. He's got some articles on Harvard Business Review, and I'm going to see him next. He went to implement the OODA loop. I don't know if you heard of that. Right?
Just say it so everybody knows it. Yeah.
Sure. It's what they learned is the substandard U.S. aircraft in the Korean War were going against the superior MiGs, and yet they had a 10-to-1 kill ratio.
Yeah.
So now, how do you do a 10-to-1 kill ratio? And it was they came up with this OODA loop thing. Orient. Yeah, it was basically orient, and then what you want to do after you're orienting what's going around, because you're observing it first, and then you're orienting. What does this mean? There's the meaning part, the beliefs. And then you have decision and action. Yep. So OODA. So first you observe and then you orient. What does this mean? And that second O, I think, is the most critical, and we don't do it. We observe and then go right into decision and action. And we don't spend time in that. And that's a loop around. So, we're looking at implementing this, and George has been doing some experiments with this in organizations as well. But that's what happens in the brain, I think, with great strategists. It sounds like you discovered that in your research.
Yeah, well, that orient, it also ties back to Senge's work, right? About the ladder of inference, right? I observe something and you might draw different conclusions than I will because we have different backgrounds. And I think X, you think Y. Now what do we do, right? Same data, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Don, what didn't I ask about that I should have? I mean, I think this was great. It's a very different way of thinking about strategy, about culture, about how you manage culture and strategy. What didn't I ask about? This has been fascinating.
I'll go up. I've so enjoyed this. Can we go on 3 more hours? Because there's a lot more we can talk.
We're gonna need some Italian wine if we're doing that. But yes. Awesome.
No, you've asked some good questions, and hopefully I was able to give a few insights that will help your viewers to move forward. We've been testing this for 25 years and implementing it in companies. So I hopefully it'll have some traction with your people as well.
I think so. A little nonlinear, but very, very interesting. And I certainly agree. All my research would say you're definitely in the right zone here. So Don, if people want to get a hold of you and get more engaged with you and your work, how would they get a hold of you?
Let's see, you have a smaller group. I'll give you my email address. It's Don@Saga Leadership, and the domain is Saga. We stole it from the Vikings, SAGA, the Saga, leadership.com. And my email address, Don@sagaleadership.com, if you want to talk to me.
Don, this was tremendous. I really appreciate your time and just some great ideas and a different way of thinking about this whole space that I think people will appreciate. So thank you.
Okay, glad I could help.
And we'll see you next time on the Lazy CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business. And our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO Podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes, and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.